Hello and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. It's a Ukraine war update video, a frontline update for the 1st of January 2023. I'm a little worse for wear. I was up very late last night. Nothing a good cup of tea can't sort out. So thank you to all those who helped me with that through Buy Me a Coffee. But yeah, so bear with me and whatnot. It's obviously a bit later than it normally is. I hope you've all had a good New Year. And speaking of New Year, let's I'm not a particularly nationalistic guy, you know my politics, but sometimes I think, yeah, UK does a pretty good job of things. Here is London, UK, normal New Year fireworks celebration that takes part around the London Eye. That's where they set the central aspect of the fireworks display, because there's a nice circular thing you can fire things off. Anyway, proper props to the designers of this display and for London for doing this. Brilliant. Using a Ukrainian song as well.
Thank you for supporting Ukraine.
This is the town which wants to open its hearts and homes to Ukrainian refugees.
London stands with all those around the world displaced by conflict, strife, and the climate.
So that's really cool. That's Sadiq Khan, the mayor of London, saying, you know, putting his money where his mouth is, I guess, in terms of, or at least, you know, pledging support for those in trouble through conflict, climate crisis, and whatnot. The only thing I'd have to say is that I don't know who was speaking before, talking about, you know, opening as a town opening their arms to sort of Ukrainian refugees. UK has actually not got a great. I mean, we've done all right, but compared to the rest of Europe, actually, we were behind the curve with help for refugees. It's quite a difficult process. I know this firsthand because actually my sister looks after refugees, so on and so forth. Anyway, nice, great to see that. Want to give that props. This is lovely. This is now across the balconies under curfew. Defiant Ukrainians singing the national anthem. Now under curfew because at the time there were air raids. There was a massive drone strike last night, which I'll talk to you about in a minute. But let's, you know, celebrate the New Year. Lovely. Love it. Love it. So that's excellent. That's really good to see. Brings a tear to my eye, quite literally. Let's get on to the usual, which is looking first at the Ukrainian official figures for the Russian losses. This is, as ever, covered with caveats, propaganda, accuracy. Russia don't produce the same kind of figures, otherwise I'd tell them as well. Okay, liquidated personnel 760, so a slight uptick there. 2 tanks, 9 APCs, armored personnel carriers, 5 artillery systems, 46 drones, 12 cruise missiles, 13 vehicles and fuel tanks, 1 piece of special equipment. I guess you could say, obviously, it's all about the drones and cruise missiles there. Fairly, you know, 5 artillery systems is quite useful, 9 APCs. But yeah, it's fairly average-ish, maybe a little higher than average on the losses of personnel. So what happened yesterday? There was the cruise missile strike I told you about that was happening as I did my Ukraine War Update extra video. So there's about 20 cruise missiles that were sent over. I don't think they had a great interception rate, so I think maybe just over half of them were intercepted. And then there was a wave of drones, which followed. There was a wave of drones before as well, the cruise missile strike. So there's been like cruise missile strike. There was, I think, drone, cruise missile, drone, cruise missile, drone. And it's been fairly consistent. Now, This could be releasing the rest of the cruise missiles and the drones, maybe that they were planning on doing previously, but then the Engels airfield got hit, and we saw fewer cruise missile strikes and missile strikes than we were expecting on the larger one. I think it was 69, and they had the capability to have released over 100, over 120, actually 124 the number was. So it could have been like an aspect of that being released in like the second wave of cruise missiles, and then you had these drones. Anyway, the drone attacks, there were 45 drones, and I think 100% of them were taken out, which is phenomenally good. I with a caveat though, which is that a lot of them are taken out by expensive missiles rather than low tech, cheaper stuff like the Gepards and whatnot, which is great. Like they're doing their job, excellent. But I don't know how sustainable that is in terms of stocks of very expensive missiles. Anyway, 32 were down above Kyiv. One of them here saying Happy New Year on it, so that's nice. That's nice of the Russians to think of writing that on a drone that is going to strike at civilian infrastructure. So well done there. 24, as I said, 24 Shahed shot down in Kiev region. Actually, that ended up being 32 in the end. So New Year's Eve, Ukrainian Air Defense Forces demonstrated a huge rate of fire from NASAMS missile systems. So these are American, Norwegian missile systems that are excellent, said Air Force spokesman Yuri Inat. And indeed, it's come out now that they barely had time to reload the missiles. They were firing at such a rapid rate, these NASAMS. There's a quote somewhere else that I saw. I'll try and find that. So a synopsis of what he said. The Speaker of the Air Force of Ukraine, Yuri Ignat, said on New Year's Eve, NASAMS air defense systems barely had time to reload launchers due to the mass attack of kamikaze drones on Kyiv. He also noted that hardly any other army in the world has such combat experience. There's a few other things he said. It's pretty interesting. So, yeah, as I've said many times, the Ukrainians are going to be the trainers of other armies around the world. They will be the most experienced operators of all sorts of stuff and have the greatest sort of most recent combat experience. So there you go. Lots of drones shot down. On as well, Donetsk has been under an awful lot of pressure last night. The city of Donetsk.
Новогодняя ночь, Донецк. Сарена, это, блядь, это Ватутина. Ватутина, вот это движняк. Сейчас был Экспо Донбасс, вот Ватутина. Это центр, ебать. Ну, центр.
I mean, so on and so forth. Just an incredible amount of ordnance being thrown at Donetsk from the Ukrainians. Serious damage being done to occupy Donetsk. Multiple explosions. No details yet. Yeah, so there you go. Another bit of news: the death of a hip hop artist, Andrei Raikkonen, who performed as that name. Echo of Smoky Porches is the translation, was found dead in St. Petersburg. He recently cancelled a concert saying he was unwell and appears to have dropped dead. I don't know whether that is anything connected to kind of Russians falling out windows, people being less than enthusiastic about Russia's war. And the last thing I'm going to say before I get onto the front lines is this video is doing the rounds. Like columns of Russian army equipment are moving towards the front in the south. Kyiv resources announced preparations for an offensive. Ukrainian videos of columns of Russian army equipment moving through Mariupol and further into new Russian regions. This is just a load of rubbish, right? So this is as I say, it's doing its rounds, this video. I mean, you need to, there's a few pointers to this not being around Mariupol. I mean, it doesn't particularly look like Mariupol greenery, really. Is that evergreen trees with leaves on, etc., etc.? Anyway, I did a bit of digging because, you know, even like New World Econ is usually fairly reliable as a mapper, does the same sort of stuff as me. He's just put that entire video on YouTube saying Russian forces prepare for offensive, large motor rifle formation spotted massing near Mariupol. And you get, you know, everyone commenting on this, oh, Russia are going to blah, 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 blah. And it's just entirely wrong. So this has been geolocated to Belarus. and to Narulia Rayon P37. So this work has been done by Encanto. It's not in Ukraine and not current, so it's previous from Belarus. But this is a road in Belarus, and that convoy was from a long time ago. So it's not a big amassing of Russian equipment in Mariupol. Mariupol, just to let you know, being down here, Belarus being up there, and the timescale being incredibly different. So anyway, let's go on to front lines. We're going to go to the northeast, Kupiansk-Svatiove-Kreminna. I don't have an awful lot of sources today. As you can imagine, it's New Year's Day, so I'll try and give you my best understanding of what's been happening. So just to start with, let's go to the Institute for the Study of War, because this is really important. Russian forces are likely depleting their stocks of artillery ammunition and will struggle to support the current pace of operations in certain sectors of the front line as in Ukraine as a result. Budanov stated that Russian forces had previously used 60,000 artillery shells per day as of some unspecified date, and now only use 19 to 20,000. So they're expending 3 times less or 3 times fewer shells than they were at some point in the past. So Budanov stated that Russian forces have also removed all remaining artillery ammunition from Belarusian military warehouses to support their operations in Ukraine. The UK Ministry of Defence reported that Russian forces currently lack the necessary stockpile of artillery munitions to support large-scale offensive operations. That sustaining defensive operations along a lengthy front line in Ukraine requires the Russian military to expend a significant number of shells and rockets daily. ISW assesses the constraints on munitions will likely, in part, prevent Russian forces from maintaining a high pace of operations in the Bakhmut area in the near term. They are talking, this is me talking now, they have been talking for days now that the Russians are culminating in Bakhmut, and there's evidence of this from a lot of indicators, and this is one of those indicators. To continue, the depletion of the Russian military's artillery ammunition stocks will likely impact their ability to conduct a high pace of operations elsewhere in Ukraine as well. This Ukrainian report that the Russians have already depleted ammunition stockpiles in Belarus is a further indicator that a renewed large-scale Russian offensive from Belarus in the coming months is unlikely. I mean, if they were to attack from Belarus, they would need all the ammunition and stockpiles they could get their hands on. So giving them all to Russia to use on the front line is an indicator they're probably not going to do that. So we go to my map, Kupiansk down to Svatova, and then down to Kreminna, this front line. Basically, hardly any news. Novosibirsk looks to be liberated, which is just next to Kuzmivka here. That's the Kraken of confirmed liberation of that. I already had that done, but a few people at Defmon are saying, yeah, definitely today that's liberated. Also, or he's saying this last night actually, repulsed attacks around Nevska, Chervona-Popivka and Bilarivka. I do not believe there's any major change in the area. So basically, not a lot of change. Defmon also says one thing should be noted. The last few days, the Ukrainian staff have reported an increased amount of vehicles destroyed. So that's true. Certain days there have been little upticks. I think it's possible that some of these are indications of counterattacks in the Svatova area. So there's quite a lot of heavy fighting being done in the Svatova area as the Ukrainians inch towards Svatova from the kind of Kuzmivka, Stelimivka sort of northwest region. Just to say that there seems to be activity up there and just up here northeast of Kupiansk in the Tavolzhanka, the Vororichna area. Just haven't heard much today. Now, I'm just going to show you some mapping from a guy, a French guy, Plevelon. Here, the interesting mapping, and I'm going to look into this guy. I don't know where he sits. I think he might be pro-Ukrainian. But it does a lot of mapping that's quite nice because it's on terrain mapping, on relief mapping, but also looking at the front lines and how they've changed over the last month. So these are his front lines today, and of course, these are his. It might not be correct, but he's shown the difference between a month ago and now. So, for example, if you look up northeast of Kupiansk, you got the Russians have advanced onto Liman Pershi and taken Liman Pershi, although the Ukrainians are fighting back. The Ukrainians have lost some ground that was previously grey zone, but the Ukrainians have pushed the Russians back further to the north up here. So that is what's happening around here, and this is Vilshana here. Looks like over the month the Russians have been pushed back there. If we come further down south to Orlianka, moving down towards Kuzmivka and Novosibirsk. We have Ukrainians making advances over the last month and Russians losing territory in the Yahidne area. I want to know more details about what's happened here, because there were some claims that Yahidne was liberated, but we haven't really heard much about it since then. So that's that map. And then we go further down south. I really do like these maps. They're nice looking maps. The movements have been, the Russians have moved towards Novosibirsk in the last month, but then actually they've lost that. That's changed hands a few times, but they lost a lot of ground here. So Kupiansk, which has apparently been liberated, Kolomychika, which is at least somewhat liberated according to many claims. So the Ukrainian line for me goes something like this. But movement for the Ukrainians marginally forward in certain places, but the Russians have actually moved forward in the last month quite a lot along this front line, as according to this mapper. My lines are slightly different. So as we come down here, you know, we are looking at grey zone along a lot of this area. He's got his Russian lines further forward, Ryrodka and so on and so forth, coming down here. Mine allows for a grey zone, but interesting stuff. It indicates that the Russians have actually, at least according to him, made advances over the last month. The Ukrainians, some small advances in places, particularly around Marinka, but there's a lot of fighting going on around Marinka right now. As we come further down, we look at the idea, as according to him, that in this Liman area, he has the Russians having a lot more control just to the north of Kreminna. Chervonopipivka is a site of Russian control with grey zone to the west. I would actually have that more generous to the Ukrainians. And then down south of Kreminna, he has done the Russians having lost Dubrova and Kuzmina, which I think is correct, and maybe moved a little bit further to the south over the month, just south of Kreminna. But right now, this is all very much dynamic, and I would say the Ukrainians have pressured the Russians and are much closer to Kreminna, as according to many sources at the moment. But still, interesting mapping shows you the difference between now and a month ago. And I'll show you more of his maps as we go further down south, because they're quite striking. Okay, so there have been repelled attacks around Chervonopipivka, Bilorivka again. Not much detail. Let's move on further down south. While I'm at it, actually, just around here, so we had Liman that was liberated in that very famous sort of encirclement. The Russians sent an S-300 missile to hit a police station there. I don't know if that's their intended target, but it hit a police station. So that's an S-300 surface-to-air missile used in its secondary mode. So the claims are, as you can imagine, repelled attacks all around here. So Berestova, Bilorivka, Yakovlivka, Soledar, and further down south. So it seems like this Yakovlivka area is an interesting one. The Russians are trying to push out in all directions for Sele, to the north and to the west as well. You have well, actually, no. We'll come to that in a little second. Let's go back to this French source. I think this shows, well, it's just quite nice mapping. You can see this Yakovlivka attacks towards Vasile, attacks up around here, and I understand as well sort of towards Soledar. Soledar is actually being attacked also from the south. The ISW saying that they're trying to move in from the south as well. That'd be from Bakhmutska. So there's an awful lot of pressure right along here to try and join up this front to make it a more sort of contiguous straight front. But obviously you've got terrain and settlements to negotiate there if you're Russian. But this is from a month ago, you can see the advance of the Russians here. So they've made some important gains, and you might say in a month that's not a lot, but actually I think this is important in the whole sort of Bakhmut scenario. And yeah, so according to it, well, if you come now and look in Bakhmut itself, you can see very clearly the gains that they have made east and south over the last month. So definite gains for the Russians. They've had you could say, and I'm using scare quotes here for those listening, a good month. Like they have made gains, but the question is at what cost? So Defmon says Bakhmut, the AFU repulsed attacks around all these places, but the Russians are making incremental gains in this area. Both the Russians and the Ukrainians are allocating huge resources for the Bakhmut fight, and it's costly for both sides. Absolutely. War Mapper's map of Bakhmut has showed that actually the Russians have made some gains northeast of the city in this sort of forested woodland area. I reported on that yesterday from Rebar. This was a Rebar. There's absolutely no report from Rebar today, or at least there wasn't at the time of recording. Yeah, it's some. I think Rebar, they are obviously pro-Russian, but there's often an element of truth to what they say, or at least there certainly used to be. They have become more propagandistic recently, as they're sort of in bed with the Kremlin. So there is this area here that the Russians have apparently liberated. Well, actually, I had them still in control of that. I didn't really pull them out of there hugely. I didn't have a lot of information, but it appears that they are much more in control of this industrial area here than I've got them. Well, no, actually, we both had them this as a grey zone, but there are claims that the Russians, as Rebar said yesterday, are in this Sinyat factory just here. So if I bring on all the labels and whatnot, the Sinyat, there are claims that the Russians might have some kind of presence there. So we could be back to a lot of contesting this industrial zone. No news about the waste sorting plant there, which I think is an important place. And then as we come down south, there's heavy fighting, Klishchivka. On the outskirts in the buildings now, rather than the Russians being down here on this slope, that there's a decline that goes down to this railway line, and the Russians were struggling to make gains up there for some time, but now they seem to be right in on the outskirts of Klishchivka. And according to the ISW, although they get the position wrong here, geolocated footage posted on December 31st shows Russian forces further west of Zenopilia, which is 4 kilometers, they claim, northeast of Bakhmut. It's actually southwest. So Zenopilia. So if this is bitten by Kupiansk-Svatiove-Kreminna, if the Russians are fighting west of there, then they are making gains around this area towards Bilahora and Avdivka. So there's fierce fighting going on, as you can imagine, all around. And this is, what the French source says here. And then we come further down south. So let's come out of there. Not too much to report from Bakhmut, details-wise. Avdivka, fairly similar to what I've been saying the last few days. So in this area between Bakhmut and Avdivka, we have Toretz, we've got New York, we've got Zelizhny. So I'm going to just show you what this French resource is showing, that over the last month there have been some gains around Troitska towards Alexandropil, but the Ukrainians have themselves gained a little in Novobakhmutivka. So just to show you where that is on my map, let's find Alexandropil. Here we are, just slightly further down south. This is in this northern part of the attempted encirclement of Avdivka. So the Russians, as I've got indicated here, have made some gains around Troitska towards Alexandropil, but the Ukrainians have gained a little further south from there. So that's reflecting my map. But the interest of this one is to say that's the monthly change there. So over an entire month, that's all that's changed hands between Bakhmut and Avdivka. As far as Avdivka is concerned, no news yesterday other than positional fighting and the usual repelled sort of attacks. And then we'll come down from Avdivka to Marinka, and there's an interesting sort of movement of territory over the last month just north of Marinka. So as we come down here again, Vodyane, Opitny, Pervomaysky, Novelsky just here, and just around Krasnohorivka there's been some movement there. So we have just sort of northwest of Krasnohorivka, the Russians have made some gains over the last month. The Ukrainians have made a little gain as well, and north of Novelsky is around there. The Ukrainians, this is Pervomaysky, and I reported that the Ukrainians did make those gains as well. But then we come down to Marinka, and you can see that while the Ukrainians have gained a little bit to the south of there, in the city itself, the Russians have made some advances over the last month. I'm just going to show you some footage. I like to do this for you to give you a sense of what these places are like, soundscape and visuals. This is Marinka at the moment. There's no sound on this one, but it gives you just a real sense of what they're fighting over, what the battlefield, if you like, is like. Very reminiscent of Stalingrad in the Second World War. Just complete devastation and ruined buildings. No kind of color, just this beige of buildings stripped back. And no life, no trees, no greenery. It's just a bit of a hellscape, really. Anyway, that's Marinka at the moment. Gives you an idea. As we come out of Marinka, and again, fierce battles there. Not really too much information about this whole area. There's just reports of shelling around exchanges across the whole sort of front line. There is this particular report that has come out about a settlement I talked about yesterday, which is just south of Leopold, and it is this one here. So I talked yesterday about there being according to Rebar, a Russian attack to Dorozhnyanka, and there have been people claiming, like even War Mapper says, Russian forces have captured the settlement of Dorozhnyanka, and have produced a map to indicate this. And you have Tendar then saying there were rumors last night that Russians had taken Dorozhnyanka, but other Russian sources like Wargonzo report only of an attack without specifying the outcome. That sounds to me more like a failed attack. I won't change anything on the maps. So there are these sort of arguments, and actually ISW talks about this. So Russian sources are likely attempting to exaggerate Russian victories and Russian military power in southern Ukraine. The Russian Ministry of Defense claimed yesterday that Russian forces captured Dorozhnyanka in Zaporizhia Oblast. A Russian military blogger claimed that Russian forces broke through Ukrainian defensive lines near there on December the 30th. That's what I reported. It is unclear whether Russian forces have captured the settlement, however. The Ukrainian General Staff reported the Russian forces shelled Dorozhnyanka, which, of course, if they shelled that yesterday on December the 31st, then that indicates that they don't have that under their control. So if the shelling is true, then it won't have been captured by the Russians. And then he goes on to actually discuss that footage I showed you earlier that is from Belarus and not from Mariupol. So that's really where we're at. That's the only news of significance along that line. It's been more about the drone and cruise missile attacks. So I don't have too much detail about any sort of HIMARS hits or other hits around the Zaporizhia and Kherson Oblast or anything going on in Crimea, other than that Zhankoy, I think, was hit yesterday, or there were explosions yesterday experienced, I think, quite early yesterday in Zhankoy. So that was hit by something, and Zhankoy is an interesting one because in terms of distance from Ukrainian-controlled territory, it is out of HIMARS range. And so the question has been when that's been previously hit, because there's an airport there, military airfield. Question is, what is being used to hit that? Is it sort of Ukrainian drones? What kind of drones? What kind of munitions? Or do they have longer range missiles that they are able to use? And if they are, would that be the number one spot they'd hit if they have maybe limited inventory of such missiles? Some people are talking about how the Ukrainians will be creating their own HIMARS style rockets, or rockets can be fired from these MLRS or GMLRS pieces of equipment that have a much longer range. So you could be that the Ukrainians say, okay, if you're not going to give us ATACMS, we'll just we'll design and make our own. And I would say absolutely. I'm sure they can do that. I'm sure the Americans would be happy enough to, well, if some money swapped hands, to give them the designs for those sort of rockets, and then they get out of providing the rockets to the Ukrainians themselves, because hey, they've made their own. And that gets around that problem. So I would imagine that there are going to be Ukrainian manufacturers working hard to produce rockets of greater range. Anyway, that's what I had to say today. Thank you so much for all your support, and welcome to the new year. Hopefully it's a much better year, and hopefully I won't be reporting on this soon. Hopefully this war will get itself wrapped up because the Ukrainians will prevail. The problem is, it looks like it might not be the case, and we could be in for the long haul here, because every time I think the Russians have got nowhere to go, they just keep and they've got no future in this, which I still think, but they just hang on tenuously for some. I don't know what their end game is, what Putin and the echelons of command are going to be thinking is their long-term victory, because I cannot foresee them taking control of even the entirety of the Donetsk Oblast, let alone yeah, again, it gets back to these strategic discussions about, what is Russia's end game, what are their potential off ramps, how do Ukraine, win this, what does it look like for them winning, can they take everything back, how long would that take, and how much will Russia be prepared to throw into this conflict before they go, yeah, we're not getting a good return on investment. I mean, the sunk cost fallacy is already being exhibited every single day of this. How long has Putin got left? Is his health deteriorating? Is there going to be, some kind of political coup in Russia? All of these factors need to be considered in wondering, how the hell this thing ends. But there you go. Answers on a postcard. Thank you so much for your support. Really appreciate that. You take care, and I will see you in a update extra video, hopefully later if I have time.